So our next presenter is Dr. Andreas Moriatis, I'm sorry. He served as the MBX's Senior Vice President of Clinical Development since June of 2025. He's also a board-certified endocrinologist with extensive experience leading clinical development programs for endocrine and metabolic indications.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andreas Moriatis. I'm an endocrinologist. I have been working on rare endocrine disease for over 20 years, combination industry and academia. And I have to say that I'm very, very excited with my very, most recent journey, developing a medication that is truly, if it is approved, will be groundbreaking for the management of patients with hypopara. It's a rare privilege for an endocrinologist, a researcher, and a drug developer to be part of a development program to develop a medication that potentially can literally change the landscape in this area. So I would like to thank my entire team that is behind me, because I'm just a messenger. There's an entire group of people, working behind this program to provide something new, something that will change the life of patients with hypopara. And I have to say I'm really intimidated today because I speak in front of, the most important audience, the patients. So I want to make sure that I can look you straight in the eyes, and promise you that in a few years we'll be able to deliver something that will change your life. So that's our mission, and I will do everything in our power to make it happen. And with that said, I would like to share with you some very exciting results from our phase 2 study with the first long-acting medication, PTH analog, truly, long-acting, because it's a medication that can be given once weekly. We have completed a phase 2 study, and a week ago, we presented the results from that study, and I'll try to, present the results today with more details, so everybody can understand what exactly, we identified. Oops. That's a disclaimer. Now, we completed a 3-month study with a new PTH analog called Canvuparatide. It's a medication that stays, for at least 1 week in your blood. And in this study, although it was quite short, and we knew that kind of the efficacy would be underestimated for the reasons I will explain in details, we did see that 63% of the patients responded to treatment. And I'll explain you what response means. Response means that you keep your calcium within the normal range, you don't take any calcitriol or any other form of active vitamin D, and you either stop your calcium supplements or your daily dose is less than 600 milligrams, which is considered, supplements that most of us, we need. In addition to that, we look at those patients that they continue the study. The second part of the study was an extension safety study, because we didn't know some of the patients, they were not able to reach an effective dose. So we had to see what happened to the patients that were able to go to a dose that would be effective for them. And as expected, the efficacy, increased significantly. We went up to 79%. And that was, quite amazing, because this is exactly what you see. We expect in those patients, the longer you treat them, and as you try to wean them off the conventional treatment, not so aggressively, take a time to prevent, fluctuations in their calcium, that's when, you ensure that your results will be even higher. At the same time, as expected with a PTH therapy, because as, a previous presenter mentioned, it's not just calcium, right? Calcium is just, what triggers a lot of the comorbidities associated with the disease. We look at every organ system that is affected by PTH deficiency. So, and the next one, as you know, it's the kidney. So we look at what happened with the urine calcium in those patients, and we did see that urine calcium did come down. At the same time, we look at how the drug affects the bones, right? Because that's another manifestation of the disease. The bones in patients with hypopara, as you know, and that's how endocrinologists we call them, they have what we call adynamic bones. There is no PTH to stimulate the turnover. Although they look good, when you take the x-rays or the bone density scans, they have very thick cortex, but the architecture is not great. So that's something that we expect to see an improvement, when you treat the patient with a PTH therapy. And of course, it was a treatment that was extremely convenient, for patients. It's once a week, okay? Not daily injections, no pills, just one shot every week. Imagine if this ends up being a treatment that will be approved, the change that will make in the lives of patients with hypopara. And the adverse events were mild to moderate, very well tolerated, nothing unexpected. And the longer the patient was staying on treatment, the less adverse event they had. That's why I'm very excited to share that with you. And I do believe it will be very important if we spend some time on explain to you the design of the study so you understand, how the different patients treated, what we did, what was the starting dose, and how this patient progressed during the trial. I don't think I need to spend too much time on the disease background. A previous presenter did a very great job, and I think you know the manifestation, the signs and symptoms of the disease better than anybody else. However, I have to say that, and I try to recall, back when I was in medical school many, many years ago, I don't think I even read that part for the exams, right? I think I skipped that. And later on, I had to do it, when I decided to become an endocrinologist. But I have to say, I'm so pleased with the trend that I do see nowadays. We didn't even have guidelines, a few years ago. Now we have guidelines for the treatment. Everything about hypopara were about the diagnosis, how to do the diagnosis. Let's find out what's the underlying gene in this syndrome. And when it came to the syndrome, we were more interested in the other manifestations of the syndrome than the hypopara itself. So clearly under-recognized. And of course, I understand because we didn't have good treatments back then, right? Everybody thought that, what is hypopara? Oh, it's nothing. Take some calcium supplement, some calcitriol, you'll be fine. We know that this is not the case. This is clearly not the case. And I do see the trend, the clear trend, not just because of the guidance, but also all the recertification exams that endocrinologists need to take. I do see more and more questions, on hypopara, specifically for treatment, which to me it's very, very encouraging, and which actually sets the bar higher for us, to deliver treatments to add to the armamentarium of the treating of the providers to use this medication to manage better those patients and change their lives. Now, in this slide, you can see the two studies, one next to each other. On the left side, you can see the first part of the study that was the double-blinded placebo-controlled study. What does that mean? We had patients that they were taking, drug, and some others that were taking an injection that was a placebo, nothing, right? And you can see in these studies, and this is actually a typical thing for a phase 2 study, we try to identify what's the right starting dose, because we learn from this study what doses and how we'll be using the drug in a phase 3 study, which is a study that we'll use for registration purpose for approval. And based on what we learned from phase 1 study, it's a study that we did in healthy volunteers. We administer this medication in patients with normal parathyroid glands, and we try to see what would be an effective dose based on what we were seeing on the endogenous PTH, the PTH that the body of a normal person produces. Because if you use like a dose that is effective, you expect to see that the endogenous, the PTH that our body produces should go down. So that's why we selected 3 dose levels to try to see which one would be the right one. And then, of course, we had the placebo group. Now, it's very important to know that when a patient participates in a placebo-controlled study, they don't know whether they're taking drug or not. The physicians don't know either. We don't know, so we're blinded. That's why we call them double-blinded trials. And it was very important to ensure that when the patient's getting into the study is not very hypocalcemic, because imagine what would have happened to that patient if, for whatever reason, ended up in the placebo group. And why this is important? It is important because the rules of the protocol, the study was designed to say every patient who starts the first dose, the injection, at the same time we decreased the dose of calcitriol and the calcium supplements they were taking. So imagine if someone was starting with a low calcium, 7.9, and you decrease the dose of calcitriol by 50%. This patient most likely would end up in the emergency department, right? We don't want that. The safety of the patient is the single most important priority. Nothing is more important than keep the patients safe in the study, which is why what we had to do, we had to ensure that the patients were stable and they had the reasonable calcium level that even if they had to decrease the calcitriol, of course, you would expect a reduction, but it would not be so catastrophic that, lead the patient, end up the patient in the emergency department. And that's why what you can see over here is what we call optimization. We try to optimize the patient. We didn't want them to be neither hypercalcemic or hypocalcemic. They had to be, the calcium should be like in a low normal or range. And that's what we did. And then for the first 4 weeks, the patient started on a fixed dose, which was 1 injection every week. A quarter of the patients started with 400 micrograms, another quarter of the patients started with 600, and another with 800, and we had the placebo group. And after those first 4 weeks, then every patient was able to go up every 2 weeks by 200 micrograms. So you can understand the dose range that we're trying to investigate at the time was from 400 to 1600, but because the duration of the study was only 12 weeks, not every patient would be able to get to the maximum dose if that was the dose that would require. So you had patients, for example, from the 400, the maximum dose they could get would be 1200. Those that started with 600, the maximum dose they would get was 1400, and only the last group would have the option to go to the maximum dose, which is why what I mentioned before, this study clearly, underestimates the efficacy, the true efficacy of this medication, which is why we wanted to investigate that further by looking, okay, what happened to those patients if you give them more time to try higher dosages in the next study? Now, what was the definition of respond? What do we define a responder? And that's, you can see here, the 3 components here. A patient should have normal calcium level, and normal was defined as 8.2 to 10.6 based on the lab that we were using. The patient should stop taking any form of active vitamin D, 0. And the patient should take daily calcium supplements less than 600, or stop the supplements altogether. But of course, at the same time, we look at a number of secondary endpoints to support the primary analysis. As you can see here, we look at whether there was any difference based on the starting dose of the patient. We look at the urine calcium, the bone turnover markers, everything that is related to hypoparathyroidism. And now, let's see what type of patients we enroll in the study. Now, that was very, what we see in this patient population. No surprises there. The average age, you can see, was around 50 years. The vast majority of the patients were, women, and, you understand, everybody knows why. The vast majority of the cases with hypoparathyroidism was patients that had surgery, anterior neck surgery, either for thyroid cancer, Graves' disease, or multinodular thyroid goiter. There was no differences in terms of the race, ethnicity, or BMI. Actually, in the study, we didn't have any limitation in terms of the BMI. We allow patients with any BMI. We got patients with BMI 52 or 53 that give us the opportunity also to investigate the efficacy across the entire range of BMI, no limitations. Now, the average duration of hypopara was around 10 years, which is like typical for our clinical trials. As I mentioned already, the vast majority were patients with post-surgical hypoparathyroidism, but we did get some patients that they had idiopathic, autoimmune. We also have a genetic form of hypopara in the trial that give us the opportunity to explore the efficacy across all types of hypoparathyroidism. The average dose of calcium was, in the 2,000. You can see here some, outrageous numbers, 13,000. I don't even know how many pills that patient was taking. I cannot even count. I think this patient was taking everything, pills, liquids, patches, just name it. It was really bad, really severe case. In terms of active vitamin D, there was a requirement that every patient entering the study taking at least 0.5 micrograms of calcitriol a day. You can see the calcium in the blood was, in the normal range because we wanted to make sure that patients that they end up on the placebo group don't become very hypocalcemic and end up in the emergency department. The PTH, as expected, was very low because that's what you see in patients with hypopara. The normal range for the assay that we used was 15 to 65, so as you can see on average we're below the normal range. And we did also measure the calcium in the urine, and we had about 45% of the patients had elevated calcium in the urine. Now, let's go to the results. As I mentioned, the study met its primary endpoint, which is, a huge thing, a very exciting thing, because that gives us the option to proceed to the phase 3 study, and we're moving to a phase 3 study with this compound. There was statistically significant difference between active and placebo, and as you can see, we look at also the individual components of the primary endpoint, the percentage of patients that they stop active vitamin D, they decrease the calcium dose below 600 milligram daily, and normalize the serum calcium. As you can see, it was statistically significant in all the individual endpoints of the primary endpoint. Now, in terms of what was, when we look at the efficacy by starting dose, we did see that, over here, that patients that they started on a higher dose, they became responders faster than the other patients. However, the 800 microgram dose was a high dose for some patients, right? And that some of them, as you can see here from the rates, they had to go down, to decrease the dose, not just by 1, but sometimes 2 dose levels. That didn't happen with the 400 or the 600 microgram dose. Again, this is a dose-finding study. Now, knowing this, we can guess, what should be the right starting dose, right? If you start with a high dose, then some of the patients, they have to go to a lower dose. But also, if you start a higher dose, a dose that actually has been effective in at least, 2/3 of the patients in the study, when the patients at the same time taking conventional treatment at the beginning, this might cause hypercalcemia. We try to avoid this. So that's what we learned from this study. We learned what our starting dose should be. And as you can see, the average dose, the median dose that most of the patients respond was around 800. So we introduced a highly effective dose right away. And you can still do it, but you have to be more aggressive on how you wean the patients off the calcium supplements and the calcium trial. You can still start with an 800, but you still tell the patient you have to stop everything right away, not step by step. Now, let's see what happened with the serum calcium, right? The top line is the patients on active drug. And as you can see at the beginning, there was a slight increase. And that was actually driven primarily by the group of patients that started with a higher dose, the highest dose of canvuparatide. But later on, as these patients, they stopped taking the supplements and the calcium trial, you can see that the calcium stabilized and stayed within the normal range throughout the study. On the other hand, the placebo group, you see that the calcium dropped like a rock right away. That again, I think was a very nice decision to have the patients make sure that we avoid enrolling patients with very low calcium at the very beginning to avoid this. Because imagine what would have happened if a patient had started with 7.9 and dropped to 6.9. All right? So as I said, safety of the patient is the single most important priority. If this is in your mind, you are on the right path. And as you can see, these patients, despite the fact that some of them, they had to go back on calcium trial, increase the calcium supplements, the calcium, was significantly lower compared to the active group. Now, the other thing that we look at, as I mentioned, we look at the changes in the urine calcium because that's the second very important, complication that we do see in patients with hypopara. And as expected, you do see a reduction in urine calcium, and this is in all patients. You see the calcium drop, but we also observe a reduction in the placebo, and that's not unexpected. This is something that has been observed in many clinical trials. And the reason that we do see the reduction in the placebo is because we optimize the treatment of those patients. We decrease their calcium supplements, we made them hypocalcemic, and that had positive effect in the urine, right? But the difference between the active and the placebo is that the patients on the active arm, they were able to keep the calcium in the urine normal, but at the same time, their calcium in the blood was normal. The patients on the placebo arm, in order to keep their calcium in the urine normal, they were, most of them, hypocalcemic. So that's the difference between active and placebo. Of course, the group of interest is the patients with elevated calcium in the urine, right? Because these are the patients that most likely will be developing the complications, the kidney stones, the nephrocalcinosis, and if that continues, could lead even to kidney failure. And as expected, the reduction in the urine calcium among patients with elevated urine calcium was much higher. And that's what you can see on the right side here. Now, let's move on to the second part of the study that patients who completed the first part rolled over. I have to say that, to me, the most convincing proof that, that the efficacy of the drug is the number of patients who completed the phase 2 study and decided to roll over. 94% of the patients say, I want to continue the study, I want to continue taking this medicine. To me, that's the proof that we're doing something good here. And every patient in the phase 2 study completed the study. We didn't have any patient who stopped because of an adverse event or anything. Every single one completed the study, completed the treatment, which is why it makes the statistical analysis so robust, because we didn't have to make any imputation, say, okay, what would have happened to this patient should this patient have completed the study? No. We included the data from every patient in the study because we didn't have to make any imputations. Every patient completed the study. Now, as I mentioned already, in the 3 months into the extension study, the study that patients were able to roll over after completing the first 12 weeks of treatment, the efficacy increased dramatically. It went up to 79%, right? And that's because we had patients that they had not achieved their maximum effective dose in the previous study, so we were able to go up and hit an effective dose and stay on that dose. But also we had patients from the placebo group that they were never treated, and now they were treated with a medication, and we had a lot of responders from that group as well. And as you can see here, there was responders and the improvement in the individual components of the primary endpoint, the independence of the active vitamin D, of the calcium supplements, and the normalization of the calcium in the blood was quite significant as well. Now, what we try to do in this, what we're showing here is we want to show you the journey of the patient from the beginning of the phase 2 study all the way into the extension study. You recall this is, this is what I shared with you already previously. This is what happened in the calcium levels in the active group and the placebo group. And as you can see here, the patients that they were on active drug and they continue, their calcium levels stay the same throughout, no changes. The most striking finding here is the placebo group, and I'll explain you why. As you can see here, the calcium levels drop, and the patients, they were going back on calcitriol, started their calcium supplements again, and the minute that they switch to the active drug in the second part of the study, you can see how quickly their calcium levels normalized, and then they stay elevated, they stay normal. And that's the proof. That's what we call the crossover study. It's a study on its own. You have someone who doesn't take anything for 3 months, and then you switch that patient back on active treatment, and that's what you see. You see the result. What it was really the difference in the placebo group over here compared to these patients over here is they didn't have to stay for 4 weeks in the same dose. This patient, they had the option to go up every 2 weeks on a higher dose till they hit an effective dose, which is why these patients very quickly, they hit an effective dose. And the response rate, if you look at the placebo alone, if you look at the 15 patients that roll over, the response rate was 93%. So that informs us, what do we need to do in our, phase 3 study, starting with maybe for the lower dose to avoid the fluctuation, the back and forth on dosing, and then being able to quickly get to an effective dose could give even better results. This is what right now we gather, and we'll present this to the FDA, and that's how we'll agree, and we'll proceed with a phase 3 study. Now, what is really important in all these changes that you see with the calcium is not because the patients that were taking calcium supplements. Actually, the patients, they stopped their calcium supplements. They stopped the active vitamin D. And as you can see, it's quite consistent. So the active vitamin D here, you see the active group, it came down very quickly, and it stayed down throughout. And the patients with the placebo, they've been fluctuating, but once they start treatment in the second part of the study, boom, came down. Same thing with the calcium supplements. So everything, ties up right here. So we did see normalization of the calcium while the patient, they were stopping their calcium supplements. Now, another important, target of a PTH therapy is bone, right? So what we did look here, we look at what was the effect of, canvuparatide on bone turnover markers. And as you know, there are two types of cells in the cortical bone. It's the osteoclasts, that what they do, they remove old bone, and the osteoblasts, that they build up new bone. In patients with hypopara, it's, because there is no PTH, there is more, there is build-up of more bone because there is no activity of the PTH to remove the old bone. So although, as I said, if you take an X-ray or you do a bone density scan, it looks like a very good, very thick bone, really robust, but the architecture is really poor. So that's why what we expect to see with a PTH therapy, we expect that the bone resorption marker, which is the first marker over here, increase, meaning that the hormone, the osteoclasts start removing the old bone, and the osteoblasts over here, they start building new bone. So it's what we call remodeling. And both of them, they do see that they're moving to the right direction. And over time, this, slows down because you don't want to see that this continues, right? This thing, becomes slower and slower, the resorption. At some point, the bone reaches a steady state. Now, let's discuss about safety, right? Because efficacy should always be, evaluated in parallel with safety. This is from the phase 2 study, and you can see over here the pooled and the placebo. As you can see that about 73% of all patients treated with canvuparatide experience at least one adverse event, but also 62% of the patients on the placebo experience some adverse event, because that's part of the disease, most of them. If you look at the adverse events that were evaluated by the investigators as related to the study drug, that number goes down, goes to 50%. The vast majority of those adverse events were mild to moderate and resolved. We had only two severe adverse events. One of them was serious. Was one patient who developed a disease called Bell's palsy, when you have part of your face drops, that's usually due to a virus. This patient was treated with steroids for 2 weeks. It resolved, and then the patient continued increasing the dose of the study drug. This patient actually responded, is still in the extension study without any issues. The second patient was a patient that was not a serious adverse event, that complained of abdominal pain. It was severe in intensity, but when you hear abdominal pain, you want to find out, okay, is it because hypercalcemia sometimes can cause abdominal pain, right? But when we check the calcium levels at the time of the event, the calcium levels were normal, so it was not because of a calcium abnormality. But it's reported. Now, we didn't have any discontinuations, as I mentioned. No patient stopped treatment, no patient stopped the study. We didn't have any deaths, so everybody completed the study, and only 4 patients did not roll over into the extension. 60 patients rolled over into the extension study. Now in terms of what adverse events was observed with a frequency at least 5% and above, as you can see, headache was the most common one, followed by some cases of hypercalcemia that I will discuss in more details. We had some patients complain of arthralgia and nausea. The injection site reaction were actually quite low, and not a surprise there because it's a weekly injection, right? It's not a compound that needs to be taken every day or twice a day as an injection. And all the other adverse events that you see here primarily, there were nothing major there. And when we look at the calcium levels for all of this, the calcium was normal, because sometimes these adverse events could imply either hypercalcemia or hypocalcemia, so we had to do this. Now, For every PTH therapy, there are what we call adverse events of special interest. These are adverse events that are directly could be linked to the PTH therapy, and that's calcium changes, either hypercalcemia or hypocalcemia. It's injection reactions, where the patients inject the medicine, and sometimes there might be irritation, pain, erythema. It could be bruising if you hit a vein accidentally, all these things. And also there is another class that I don't include here because we didn't observe any, which is called vasodilatory adverse events. These are, PTH can cause vasodilation, so that can cause a reduction in the blood pressure. Patients can feel, dizzy and lightheaded, and the heart rate goes up. We didn't have any of that. Now, in terms of hypercalcemia, as you can see, we had 9 patients out of the 48 that developed hypercalcemia. Only 1 patient required to go into the emergency department, and that was just to confirm that the calcium was elevated, because that was a requirement for the protocol. If it's abnormal, you need to confirm it with a second test, and that resolved. That was observed, at the beginning of the trial. This patient was in the treatment group that started with the highest dose, which is, as you see, that's if you start a highly effective dose and you're still taking a lot of calcium and calcitriol, that's what happened, right? Once this patient, they discontinue the calcium supplements and the calcitriol, it resolved. It never happened. This patient actually went back to the same dose and did great. And we had also hypocalcemia events, but as expected, the hypocalcemia events were more common in the placebo group, right? Because the drug doesn't cause hypocalcemia, right? The drug causes hypercalcemia, if anything, if it's used in doses, higher than the patient is needed. And one of them required urgent care visit. We didn't have any hospitalization. No patient had to stay in the hospital, not even overnight, for any of those events. And the result without any sequelae. And these are the patients that actually then they have to go up on the dose. And this patient in the extension study actually had a very nice improvement, normalized calcium levels and he's not taking any supplements right now. In terms of the injection site reaction, you can see we had 9 patients that developed injection site reaction. We had also 2 in the placebo, right? Because this is a mix of all what I mentioned. It's irritation. It is, erythema, redness around the site of the injection, but also if the patient accidentally hits a vein, you can see bruising. The good thing is that because it's not something that the patient needs to take every day, it resolves. Imagine if you have to do this every day or twice a day, and you have an injection, and then on top of this, you have to inject yourself again and again and again. That's why that's an additional advantage, for this treatment if it's approved. Now, in summary, the results from the phase 2 study were very, very, very encouraging, very promising, and we're moving forward with, to the phase 3 study. There are certain steps that, we need to do before we launch the study. We need to meet with the agency, with the FDA, to come to an agreement, and I hope the government will open by the time we meet with them. And of course, we'll be presenting the results from all the results, because what I present to you today was just the top line. We have additional results that we'll present in a meeting next year, one of the Endocrine Society meetings, where we'll find out which one. And of course, we'll have a manuscript publication that will be summarizing all the findings from the phase 2 study. And of course, because the extension study that I mentioned is still ongoing, we'll continue to monitor those patients. We'd like to see, what happened with the response over time. We want to look also at the bone density scans, because it's another thing. So we continue to monitor, we continue to evaluate, and the longer safety data we get, the stronger our case is getting with the regulatory authorities for the approval of the medication. That's all I had today. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take.
As a reminder, we have the microphones here, and then Michelle has some online.
Is there a way to follow your
I'm sorry?
Is there a way to follow your progress?
Yes. No, not here. No. Online, we'll be presenting, the data. The next step is to we'll present the data after the patients have completed 52 weeks of treatment, about a year on treatment. And we'll present this. Will be press releases for that, and we'll have manuscripts if we have to.
Curious how to get to that.
Your website.
Yeah, in the website, in our website, on the MBX website, you can find everything. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Who goes first?
I wanted to know, in terms of the canvuparatide, is it a similar chemical structure to Forteo and Yorvipath, or is it like a different? I know that, like, for example, Natpara was like an 84 protein chain, and then Yorvipath is like a 34.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if canvuparatide is similar.
Yes. So canvuparatide, as you know, the biologically active part of the PTH hormone is the first 34 amino acids. The PTH hormone has 84 amino acids. The part that binds to the receptors is the 134, which is teriparatide. Canvuparatide is the first 32 amino acids is the same. Then they have the 33 that actually binds to a fatty acid, which binds to albumin, and that's what provides the long-acting activity of the medication. So it's very similar. I don't want to say identical. It's different by one amino acid. Yeah.
And I had one more question, sorry. I wanted to know, as part of your phase 2 or as part of your phase 3, if you are asking qualitative questions in terms of effectiveness. One of my issues with the what were they calling it, the pathway study for Yorvipath, is that once I got to 8.3, the pharmaceutical company was like, no, you're good. And I was like, I don't feel well, though. So, I wanted to make sure that that's something that you're taking into consideration, because it was a fight for me, so.
Yeah, in the phase 2 study, the rule was to bring the calcium above the normal range. But if a physician investigator felt that, the patient was symptomatic, right, didn't feel well, they had the option to go higher. And of course, this is something that we will definitely address. We'll try to find what's the right, because as you know, maybe an 8.3 is fine for you. I could not tolerate that. So we need to find what's the right for the patient. That's why we individualize that. And at the same time, you don't want to push the calcium so high. This is why at the same time you want to see, okay, is it by pushing the calcium high, what happened with the urine? Because you don't want to end up in the situation to create what we call iatrogenic hyperparathyroidism, right? You have to look also, if you overtreat the patient, how the kidneys react and balance this.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Okay, I've got a question you may or may not be able to answer. I'm athletic, I've done Ironman, and one of the things that I've struggled with my disease is being able to have medication that lasts to handle my workout abilities. And I was wondering if that's something you've seen in the study subjects, or something that maybe you guys foresee in the future in subjects.
Yeah. So what I can tell you is some reports that we get from investigators. We had patients that were actually marathon runners, in the study, and they did great. That's all I can say. But it's not something that we have formally, captured in the study. But this is what we hear from investigators. The other thing that, and thank you, that's a great question, is besides the fact that we had so many patients that roll over into the extension study, the feedback that we get from the investigators, which is not reflected in any of this data that I share with you, is how the patients feel with this treatment, right? We have investigators sharing with us that we have patients that they had stopped working and now they're back to their work. They have patients that they were not stopped exercising, now they're back exercising. Sometimes if we replicate, what I just shared with you in the phase 3 study, and this drug is approved, imagine that you get an injection, have come here, on this trip to Dallas, right, to participate. You don't have to carry, the injection with you. You get it like a week ago, so every Sunday you say, okay, that's when I need to take my medication, and that's it. You don't need to have this constant daily reminder that you need the medicine, to continue to go on with your day. That's what we're aiming for. We have set the bar very high, because if we manage to a hormone with such a short half-life, right, only like a few minutes, you manage to formulate it to stay in your blood for 7 to 10 days, that's a huge thing. But of course, we have to do what needs to be done to get this to the finish line and make it available for the patients.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
All right, how about Liz? Go.
I have a bunch of questions, so why don't you go first, because you might have one.
I think you might have answered my question already, but I was just wondering, for the patients who are taking the weekly injection, whenever they come up to their next dose, maybe the day prior or the day of for their next dose, were they reporting any loss of efficacy at that time, or was that something that was not studied?
Yeah, in the protocol, we're allowing it actually, to take the medication even up to 3 days after day 7, right? Of course, the longer you wait, the worse it gets. But of course, if you go from a daily injection to a weekly injection, it's always good to be on time, take it. And also it's good to remember it, right? Think of it, you set like in your app or somewhere, okay, it's Sunday or it's Monday or, the day, it's time to get this. Yes, but we have cases, of course, patients that they delayed, they took it like 12 days later, yes, the calcium dropped. But for patients that they were taking around, within what we had in the protocol, they did well.
Perfect, thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so mine is, the first one is the life happens category. So something very stressful happens, or you go to a party and you have a drink or too much sugar, something that would lower your calcium. The fact that you're taking a drug just once a week, how does that affect it? Do you just take some extra calcium, or you don't know? Or you get COVID, sickness makes, at least my calcium goes down if I'm sick.
So you're asking if there are the sick day rules, if you have to take...
Well, because you're only injecting once a week. Like I've been on Forteo, that's a very, you just give yourself a little more, and that's a very short half-life, or other drugs where it's every day. How does being on a weekly drug affect being ill and having it mess with your calcium? Do you know?
The calcium levels, they're stable throughout the week. It's not that you have days that your calcium goes off the chart and then comes down, right? You can see this, at the beginning of the treatment when you're still taking conventional treatment, right? When you at the same time you take calcium. But, over time, when you stop this and you just take the right dose for you, your calcium levels should not be fluctuating.
Okay. What about, you were talking about weight. If people have different BMIs, do they need different amounts of medication, or if their weight fluctuates, or does that not matter?
This is something that we're evaluating right now to see if there is any need, because in the study, as I mentioned, we didn't have like a threshold for BMI, because other clinical trials, they had that. We didn't have any threshold, so we have the opportunity to see if there are dose adjustments required, for patients with higher BMI or lower BMI.
Okay, and I was looking at your slide when you were referring to reductions in urine calcium, where they were below, I think, 250. And unless I read it wrong, it seemed like your data was the same for both the 400 microgram as well as the 800. You both had like 56.3. I just thought that was interesting. That was the exact same number. I would think the people that were taking more might have had a better reduction, but it just seemed unusual that they were the same.
Are you referring to the urine calcium?
Yeah, it was in your slide. The numbers looked the same. For the people like in the 400 microgram and the 800, and then you were showing people where you got their urine calcium below 250. It looked like they both were 56.
Can I see the slide so I can just...
Yeah.
How can we go back to the slides? What's your question here?
It was the year. It was a number. It showed the people. That's not the right. It was a different slide.
Which one? This one?
No, it maybe go back. It had like the percentage of the people that had something.
Say that again. Okay. This one?
No, I'll look at them later. I don't want to. And then the last question is, where is your drug manufactured, and would supply chains or tariffs, if the political situation continues, affect the drug if it actually goes to market?
The drug is manufactured in the United States.
So it doesn't matter. Okay, thank you.
All right, you're very welcome.
All right, Michelle, couple questions?
Yes, I have some. Why is the normal range considered 8.2 for this trial when most people do not feel well at 8.2?
Yes, so this is what we use because traditionally the 8.2, it's a kind of a goal that we use for the conventional treatment. That's why we said, we'll try this. But I can tell you most of the patients, they had levels much higher than 8.2. You can see the average in the graph that I shared with you was close to 9, not to 8.2.
Okay. My next one is, will there be a dose-finding study or guidance for patients trying to transition from one PTH therapy to this medication? There may be quite a difference in starting dose if someone is already on a high dose of another PTH?
Yes,
sure
this
I
is a study that, we definitely, we need to consider, and especially when we're close or after approval, because right now the studies were designed how to switch patients from conventional treatment into, a weekly dose of a PTH therapy. To answer that question, we have to do a separate study for that, to find what's the exact question, because we're not going to be in a situation that the patient takes once weekly and then gets injection until we hit their effective dose. But definitely, we'll try to see if there is any, if you can match, what's the dose of a daily or twice daily is equivalent to a weekly dose, but that would require like a separate study.
Okay. The next one is, has this study shown any reversal in kidney function so far? In other words, if a patient has had CKD, is this showing that that is getting better?
We have not released the results yet. This will be part of the manuscript, and what I share with you today are top-line results. But we did look into that. It's one of the endpoints that we'll be seeing in the manuscript and the presentation that we'll have next year.
Okay. Are there any antibodies to this medication being seen?
We did check for antibodies, and we did antibodies in only 2 patients. But what was really striking, this patient, they had already antibodies prior, before their first dose. So most likely they were patients that had been treated with another PTH treatment in the past, and that's why. So the short answer is no, we haven't seen.
Okay. And then someone is asking, do you anticipate for your phase 3 trial, if someone was on another PTH, that there would be a washout period in order to participate?
Yes. The patient needs to wash out and needs to be on the conventional treatment, because we're not doing the study when we'll be switching from one PTH therapy to the other. Has to be a conventional treatment. And why is that? Because it will be very difficult to do a study and have patients, getting 2 different injections, once a week and then daily. That becomes really complicated for a registration study. But this is a study that, we could definitely, consider in the future. Because I understand if there is a weekly available dose, and there will be the need for it provided to say, okay, how am I going to do the switch without having the patient go through the conventional treatment again and then into the weekly injection?
Let's do one more. I'm not sure I understand this question, but maybe you will. It says, what is the bioavailability of this drug? I have no idea.
Bioavailability in terms of
That's what the question,
the half-life, you mean?
maybe that's what they're asking. It came in online.
It's a weekly medication. It stays more than a week, in the blood, which is why we allow to use it like once a week.
Okay. That's all I have.
Okay, well, thank you
Okay.
so much.
You're very welcome.